the queue for this.
Where we're at with that.
Okay, we are now officially broadcasting.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So,
So what kind of dog do you have?
She's a boxer beagle mix.
Wow, a boxer beagle.
She's a little too big for a small apartment, you know, but
Yeah.
in DC, typically, you know, you can be outside a good amount of the time. So
Yeah.
it's not too much of a problem. But on lockdown, it makes it a little more difficult for her to be getting out and about. But she likes it where we're at now. So she's functioning well.
That's great. We all have dogs.
What type of dogs do you have?
Yeah. Elizabeth, tell him about yours.
I have a pug beagle.
Yeah.
It was found by some people in the communications office here at Kenyon. And they rescued it, took it to the local shelter where they kept it for like 3 days. And no one showed up to get it. But this dog I've never had a dog as an adult. And I grew up in a home where like the dog was in this tiny house, you know, outside. It was horrible, horrible. We didn't know any better. But this has been the perfect dog for us, for my girls and me.
So I have a Finnish Laphound. He's a Lapland dog. They are traditionally reindeer herders. My husband's from Russia, and he has always wanted one of these dogs. And so we found somebody who would let us come around and look at them. And it's really weird, but the Finnish Laphound committee in America is like really tight and very mafia-esque. There's one person who gets to decide where the dogs go, who gets what. So we have him, and he's adorable, lots of energy, and he was perfect for me in Ohio. Here, I feel like he feels a little constrained, but there's a lot of green outside, and I'm able to go out and walk him. I'm in like a near Boston suburb.
Okay.
But yeah, so there is a chance that you might hear something. This is what I'm worried about, that the cats and the dog are suddenly going to make an appearance. So we'll try to avoid that.
We have 9 people who have entered the room.
Ooh, that's awesome.
And for those of you who have entered, we are just waiting and talking and relaxing. So I moved my setup around a little bit. Last week I was told I was super dark, like I was in the shadow during the reading. So I've switched so that the window's behind me.
That's good.
I think it's working pretty good. What is the painting behind you, Misha?
I have no idea, actually. It's one of my husband's finds. He found it and he put it up here, and I have just gone along with it. Sort of, it's just some sea. He really likes the water. St. Petersburg, it makes sense. He grew up with sea all around him. So yeah, really likes the water.
Kyle, what's your background?
Tell us about that pan.
I think this is a guest room in the house where I'm staying. It's like the upstairs room, so it's slanted, you know, in this guest house. And that's about all I know about it. It's pretty quiet up here, so I can work. This is where I've been working for the past couple of weeks since we came up here. And it's nice. It's quiet. I'm getting sick of it, but you know, I think everyone's probably getting sick of seeing the same rooms over and over again.
Yeah.
So now's the time I'm going to pull out the embarrassing story question. People in the audience, I asked these people to think ahead of time of some embarrassing story they could share while we are waiting for folks to arrive. So, and I guess I'll go first because mine's probably the simplest and not all that embarrassing. And I just thought of it as we were gathering. I put on hand sanitizer before starting this webinar, just not even thinking, but I just wanted to keep you guys safe. And of course, that was pointless.
That's really nice, Elizabeth.
I did it, and it's a little embarrassing, so I'm sharing that. What about you, Kyle?
Well, I don't think mine's that great either, and I just thought of it because of Kenyon, but I think I'm still pretty outstanding on my parking tickets for Gambier, so if anybody's listening in the administration, I could use some amnesty probably on that. So, unpaid parking tickets, that's it.
You could park literally across 5 parking spots right now. So, except for construction happening right outside my window, which I'm kind of worried about. It's so quiet, so quiet.
Are they still doing that?
Yeah. There's some big pieces of machinery right outside of Finn House.
Okay.
There was a jackhammer earlier, but hopefully that's not going to start back up again. Misha?
Okay, my turn.
Which is the whole reason this question is made.
In case people haven't noticed yet, I have like a tooth missing. And I would like to point out that this tooth wasn't missing at the beginning of March. But I still had a baby tooth well into my 30s. And that tooth I'd been to several dentists and they were always like, the tooth's fine and there's a new tooth that's grown in and it's all fine. So do you want to take it out? And I said, no. And then one day it started shaking. And then a few weeks ago, I bit into a taco and the tooth just went back. It still didn't come out. And I did try to convince my husband to hit me, but so that we could get the tooth out. And he said, absolutely not. Domestic violence. You're going to get me written up for it. Anyways, the point is I no longer have the tooth. And another tooth is coming in. I think it's 1/8 of the way in. And I kind of like to think of myself as a literary pirate at this point. And I like to smile a great deal and point at it. So
But
I don't know if I'm embarrassed by this, but yes.
Not that you should be, but it's a quirky story to add to the banter. We have reached 4:31, and we have a nice batch of people who have tuned in. So I think I will begin. I'm going to read from a script here for a moment. It's going to be the 3 of us, and then once I'm done, it will just be Misha and Kyle, as long as I can do this quickly enough. And then when Kyle starts, it will just be Kyle. Let's see. Okay, so here we go. Hello, and welcome to the Kenyon Review Virtual Reading Series. My name is Elizabeth Dark, and I am Associate Director of Programs here at the Kenyon Review. I come to you this afternoon from the KR offices in Finn House on Kenyon College's campus in Gambier, Ohio. This afternoon, we are honored to be hosting a virtual reading with the Washington Post journalist and Kenyon College alum, Kyle Swenson, and we are grateful to all of you who are joining us for this event. In a few moments, Kenyon Review's prose fellow, Misha Rai, will be introducing Kyle. Kyle will then share his work with us for about 20 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A time with Kyle. You, as an audience member, are able to send a question or comment at any time during this reading by using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I, as the host, will receive your questions and comments, and when the time comes, I will ask them for you. We will likely not be able to get to all questions, but we will get to as many as we can. And you will note the chat feature is not operating for this event, nor can an audience member be seen or heard. Before I give the floor to Misha, I want to share with you all a way that you can purchase Kyle's books. Here we go. I trust this is working. Oh, let me get rid of that. Okay, this is our Kenyon Review page. And then if you go to events and reading series, you'll see our calendar. And while I have you here, let me point you to the fact that next week we have 3 poets actually reading. Molly McCulley Brown and Susanna Nevinson will be reading on Monday. And then Oliver De La Paz will be joining us on Tuesday. But if you go to the top of this, there's the KR Bookshop. If you click that link, you can go to the bookstore that we have through our website. And all of the books written by writers in our KR Virtual Reading Series are here, including Kyle's, Good Kids, Bad City. So at any point, that will be there always, not just during this event, and you can go there and order a book. I will now silence myself and hide myself, and I will let Misha introduce.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for hosting the Kenyon Review reading series. Thank you to everyone out there for choosing to show up and support our readers. My name is Misha Rai, and I'm the Kenyon Review Fellow in Prose. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Kyle to our audience. Kyle Swenson is a reporter with the Washington Post. Prior to joining the Post in 2017, he covered South Florida for the new Times Broward-Palm Beach. His reporting on the criminal justice system and features have won several national awards, including the Sigma Delta Chi Award from the Society of Professional Journalists and the Salute to Excellence Award from the National Association of Black Journalists. In 2015, he was a finalist for the Livingston Award for Young Journalists. His first book, Good Kids, Bad City, A Story of Race and Wrongful Conviction in America's Rust Belt, was published by Picador USA in February 2019. Take it away, Kyle.
Thank you so much. And, thank you to the Kenyon Review for having me. And for everybody who's tuning in, I hope you're all safe and washing your hands and everything. And I hope you're all on lockdown and getting through it okay. So my book, this is a real treat to be here, not only because I went to Kenyon. Obviously, Kenyon was a great deal in making me the writer that I am and the journalist I am. And also it was really actually responsible for pointing me towards journalism, my time there. But I should say, just to give you a little rundown of the book. So the book's called Good Kids, Bad City. And it's a story about a 1975 wrongful conviction that took place in Cleveland, Ohio, which is my hometown. And on May 19th, 1975, there was a murder at a corner store on the east side of Cleveland, which is predominantly the African-American part of town. And a 56-year-old white money order salesman was killed at a corner store. And a few days later, 3 young black kids, their names were Ronnie Bridgman, who was 17 years old, Ricky Jackson, who was 18 years old, and Wiley Bridgman, Ronnie's brother, who was 21 years old. They were arrested and eventually convicted of committing this murder that happened about 2 streets away from where they all lived. And when they went to trial, the only evidence that the state put against them was the testimony of a 12-year-old boy from the neighborhood. His name was Edward Vernon, who said that he'd seen these 3 young men from the neighborhood kill this white man, this money order salesman, who was making his rounds through the neighborhood that day and stopping at this particular store. They were each tried separately. They were each convicted, and they actually, all 3 were sent to death row in 1975. They were only not executed because in 1977, a Supreme Court ruling ended up converting all death sentences to life sentences. And so they were all then sent to prison for what should have been the remainder of their lives. But if you fast forward, in 2011, I met Ronnie Bridgman, the youngest of the 3. He had since been released from prison. He'd been paroled out. He had changed his name to Kwame Ajamu, and he was looking for someone to investigate their story. At the time, I was a reporter at a small alternative newspaper in Cleveland, the Cleveland Scene, and he asked me to look into this story. I was a pretty green, young reporter at the time. I was about 25. I'd been a reporter for a couple of years, but I definitely didn't have a lot of experience doing the type of investigative journalism that this type of story would require. But over time, in 2011, I investigated the story. I did a lot of reporting. Kwame and I really worked together on the story. And eventually, I wrote an article that was published in June of that year and eventually led to the Ohio Innocence Project taking up their case and eventually led to their exoneration. So that's kind of the, unfortunately, spoiler alert, big picture narrative of the story. But right after these men were exonerated in 2014, I realized that there was a much bigger story to tell here. And I realized that this was not just a story about their individual case, it was also a story about the city of Cleveland, like I said, my hometown, but about how the racial dynamics and the racial history of that city, particularly from the 1950s and 60s, all the way up to, past 2000, the new millennium, really had directly impacted the outcome of this case. And it became very much interesting for me as a person from Cleveland to look back at this city that I had grown up in and really kind of actually for the first time kind of learn its history, specifically its racial history, and realize how that could impact something as like a murder case. It's also the story about how American institutions have shifted over the last 70 years, that same period between the 1950s and 60s to the 1970s. It's about how these institutions like our criminal justice system and our police departments have become politicized and have shifted in a way that really keeps down African Americans and other minorities, and prominently focuses on them in an equitable way. And I realized that this case was a particular way that I could explore that and tell that story. Many of you are familiar with books like New Jim Crow, which really outline the systemic issues of that change that I'm talking about. This, I realized, directly again impacted and went back to this particular murder case. It's also a story in a way about storytelling. If you think about it, our court system the way our court system works is it's a battle between differing narratives. And in this particular case, for Ronnie, Wiley, and Ricky, the state fastened to them a narrative, a story that wasn't true. It was based on a lie. And the reporting that I did in 2011 and later was all about poking holes into that story poking holes into the story that the state had kind of fixed to them. And it also really is about the responsibility I think that storytellers have. And this is something that I think about every day as a reporter, because, we come into these situations and we're reporting and writing about people who have very different backgrounds from us, who are of different races, different ethnicities, different economic backgrounds. And when you do that type of work, I believe you really have to confront your own prejudices and your own blind spots when you come to report on those stories. And I'll give a really good salient example of that. When I first met Kwame Ajamu, if you picture me, 25 years old, pretty green reporter, Kenyan grad. When we first met, I spoke with him and he told me this story and I believed him. He was a very truthful guy. He seemed not to be kind of, lying to me. And there's only one little part of me that I would say held back. And what I realized was that in my mind, I thought, well, could three young men really be wrongfully convicted in 1975 and then spend decades in prison and never get out? I thought that the criminal justice system must have the safety nets involved or the guardrails there, where even if a jury had gotten it wrong, at some point, there would have been a process in the criminal justice system that would have righted this wrong. And as I reported this story originally, I realized that I was completely wrong about that there are no safety nets, there are no guardrails, the criminal justice system misfires all the time, that innocent people are convicted of crimes they didn't commit at a shocking rate. And I realized that that little part of me that held back from initially believing Kwame was all about who I was and where I was coming from as a person. And that was as, a white, suburban, middle-class kid who had never had any experience with the criminal justice system, who had never had anyone that I knew be involved in the criminal justice system. And so coming to this story, I realized that I had that kind of blind spot, that I was carrying that perspective with me, and I was carrying that perspective with me, and it blocked me from initially seeing what was actually happening with this story. And that's a great lesson, I think, for a journalist. And it's been a great lesson for me in journalism moving forward, and one that I think is one of the key realizations of my life, is that every time we step into a situation and every time we sit to tell a story, we really have to be careful about what we're bringing ourselves into that story, and how much of what we're seeing is based on who we are. So I'll jump into the reading right now. This is from the third chapter. So this is in this section. So the murder's already happened. This chapter opens on May 25th. 1975. So a few days earlier, the murders happened. This is told from the perspective of Ricky Jackson, one of the 3 young men who were arrested and convicted. He's actually at his best friend's house, the Bridgman's brothers, who will get arrested with him and convicted with him. They had been all out that night, hanging out, and he was crashing at their place when they were arrested. So this is to give you a little flavor of how they were arrested in those first few hours when they were incarcerated by the Cleveland police. Stabs of light wheeled across the front window. Ricky always woke easily, and the play of beams in the dark outside fished him up from a thin sleep on the sofa. A burglar, he thought, from the couch in the Bridgman's front bedroom. Before his mind flipped to any other possibilities, gun barrels were coming through the door. The first officers inside rushed Ricky. The teen was shoved down into the cushions, arms twisted behind his back. From where he was pinned, Ricky could see directly into Mrs. Bridgman's bedroom. One cop had the 57-year-old woman by her leg, the other by her arm. They handled her like baggage, dragging her out of bed while her pained moans filled the hallway. Mrs. Bridgman's heart was bad, Ricky knew. She fell to her knees between the 2 cops. They yanked her up and marched her out of the room with her hands behind her back, a perp walk in her own home. Ideas crashed in on Ricky all at once. What the hell was going on here? They've got the wrong house. It wasn't unusual to find the Bridgman brothers' best friend at their address late at night. Ricky's stepdad flipped the locks at home at midnight, so if you weren't in by then, you weren't getting in. On nights like tonight, when the 3 friends killed hours driving the East Side and Wiley to Sebring, Ricky would just stay over. The 3 had been out till nearly 4 a.m. before heading inside and smoking weed, the joint wrapping their heads in woolly static and clapping more confusion over the chaos now spilling out in the home. Wiley had actually been the first to the door when the banging started. As the cops pushed inside, the eldest Bridgman son darted into his mother's room, hiding behind the door. Like some silent movie slapstick, officers stepped into the room, in and out, looking for anyone else, but failing to see him. Finally, a plainclothes detective eyed Wiley in the door crack. He yanked Wiley roughly from his hiding spot. Down the hall, Ronnie was asleep in his room when he felt his toe twitch. Popping his eyes open, he found a half-dozen cops standing over his bed. The pistols and shotguns worried him less than the sounds of his mother's shouts from the hallway, and the teen shoved past the officers. Despite his repeated questions, the only information he could squeeze from the cops as they began ripping up the house was that they were looking for Ricky Jackson and Wiley Bridgman. What do you want us to do with this guy? One of the cops asked a sergeant, pointing to Ronnie. The white-shirted cop looked over at Ronnie. Take him downtown. For what? For getting in the damn way. With the handcuffs biting their wrists, the 3 boys were pushed outside. A dozen police cars flung ribbons of red and blue light around Arthur Avenue. Past the blocky shadows and street lamps, Ricky could see more patrol cars at his house. His own mother, stepdad, and brother and sisters were all laid face down on the pavement. Jump ahead to when they're actually at the police station. Heavy lights bleached half the room. A 20 by 10 sweatbox on the 4th floor of the Central Police Station downtown. The desk sergeant on duty stood by the door, looking like he could care less, like this was someone else's headache. He barked at the 7 young black guys inside to take off their hats, put out their cigarettes, and line up wherever they wanted on the 7 slots marked out on the wall. Ricky walked to the very end, number 7. Wiley was 6 paces down, number 1. Ricky had shaken off the initial shock from the raid hours earlier, but he was still clueless about why they were there. The 7 men faced a mesh screen dividing the room. The other side was dark, with the bright lights, the other side was dark, and with the bright lights daggering into his eyes, Ricky could only spot vague shapes on the far end. The desk sergeant ordered the group to step forward. Turn to the left, turn to the right, turn around, face the front again, step back. The lock-step routine over, only silence came from behind the screen. The desk sergeant told the 7 men to follow him out into the room. It was over, but Ricky still wasn't any closer to piecing together what was happening. Ricky was quiet, but far from oblivious. Ronnie and Wiley, with their liquid charm, could make easy, quick peace with whatever situation they were in. Ricky tended to hang back. But inside that reserve, he was alert, constantly observing and assessing. He liked to have the facts before acting or committing to something. The reticence was a natural byproduct of his upbringing. His family had moved often, hopscotching the East Side 10 or more times. He often got tired of the social dance routine involved in making new friends. He kept to himself, and he killed hours by aimlessly riding the city bus for as long as the change in his pocket lasted. If he got lost, he'd simply cross the street and hop on a bus going the opposite way. These wanderings often took him to the Cleveland Museum of Art, probably the last place on earth you'd expect to find him, a poor black kid from the East Side, squeaking his shoes down the halls, the high church of Cleveland's culture, a marble testament to the buying power of institutional steel and manufacturing capital. Sunshot Monets, glowering Dutch masters, puzzle piece Picassos. Ricky's favorite part of the building was the Armory Court, an exhibition of medieval weaponry. There in the middle of the room stood a knight and a horse fully decked for battle, the shiny metal catching the sunlight drifting from the glass ceiling. The only horses that Ricky ever saw in real life were carrying policemen. His mother, Essie Mae Copeland, had been a 15-year-old girl and learned she was pregnant. This was the late 1950s, in the same haunted big cotton flats that birthed the stark blues of Robert Johnson in the White Citizens Council movement. Essie Mae's mother and father sent her off to Cleveland to live with relatives. The baby's father, Ronald Carter, went too. The couple, two slow-talking Southern kids, 850 miles away from everything they knew, plunked down the fast-lane rhythms of the industrial North, settled near Central Avenue. Ronald got work at a gas station nearby. Some of Ricky's first memories were taking his father's lunch to him every day, ham and cheese with mayo and a tomato slice. Ricky learned early that if he wanted to understand his parents or what was happening in the house, he'd have to pick it up on his own. His parents weren't the type to talk and explain. In 1965, with a new baby brother in the house, stiff white people began making regular visits. New cheese and oatmeal would then appear in the cupboard, but for some reason, Ricky's father could never be around at the time. Even his clothes had to be hidden. Ricky could see these visits were putting a strain on his parents. His father was out of work. As a condition of the welfare aid, Ricky later learned an unmarried adult couldn't stay in the house. His father started coming back less and less, and then he was just gone. Essie Mae didn't explain. She just kept on moving from place to place. Essie Mae from boyfriend to boyfriend. Sometimes the guys were nice. Sometimes they drank and hit her. When Essie Mae had had enough, she took her family, which eventually included 2 more brothers and a sister for Ricky, to another part of the East Side. There was no camouflaging the fact they were poor, but Essie Mae never let them go hungry or sleep on the street. The journey north hadn't rubbed out her sense of Southern decorum. She was a drill sergeant about keeping her kids in clean clothes and combed hair. Even when they only had milk crates for furniture and 2 chip plates to eat off, she would keep them immaculate. If they didn't have a place to stay, she would get the whole family on a bus to some far-flung distant relative and march her children inside over protests or excuses. As Ricky got older, he could read his mother better. To her children, Essie Mae yo-yoed between angry and sad, otherwise keeping her feelings out of sight. Whatever crashed around inside her, she couldn't box that all up in words, much less explain it to her children. All that surfaced was an unshakable loneliness. Ricky felt an unsatisfied yearning pulsing off his mother, a gap that home couldn't patch. Sometimes she'd pull Ricky aside, palm him some cash, and tell him he had control of the house. Then she'd vanish. 3 days, 7 days, 10 days. Once the family was living in an apartment on Huff after the riots. He took to calling the cratered neighborhood Baby Beirut. She was MIA when they cut the power at night. Essie Mae hadn't paid the bills. Ricky and the 4 kids laughed it off at first. Then they heard the rats. They began by chewing through food in the kitchen. Then they were bolting across the family room. Soon all the kids were huddled on the bed screaming, Ricky vainly tossing shoes at the scurrying shapes. Does anyone need to make a phone call? The desk sergeant's question yanked Ricky's thoughts back to his current situation at the police station. Despite all the history between them, he knew he needed to let his mother know what was happening to him. Along with Wiley, he followed desk sergeant to a phone bank down the hall from the lineup. Essie Mae's phone wasn't working, so they dialed the Bridgman house, hoping Mrs. Bridgman could relay the message. As the call was going through, Ricky spotted 2 detectives enter the room with a young boy from the neighborhood, the paper boy, Darlene's brother, Ed Vernon. Toothpick arms and legs, face fishbowl behind glasses that looked thick enough to stop a bullet. Ricky got it then. Word had been going around the neighborhood that Ed was telling folks he knew who did the killing at the cut rate earlier in the week. Ricky looked at Ed. Ed looked at Ricky. Ed pointed at Ricky and said something to the detectives. Ricky knew then that this was all about the dead man up on Fair Hill. And I'll stop there, and I guess we can take some questions if that's what you guys want to do next.
Yes. Let me get myself back on. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I've got to get Nisha on and myself. Hi, you two.
Hello.
Hello.
Only problem is me. Okay, there we are. Thank you so much, Kyle. That was fantastic. I really appreciated your setup for the book before you started reading. It is a wonderful piece of journalism and literary nonfiction.
Thank you.
We have some questions, and I will start with one from our Kenyon Review associate, Kate. What challenges did you face when writing Good Kids, Bad City? Did writing a longer piece affect how you approach your shorter pieces of journalism?
Well, initially, you know, as I mentioned, I had written a 2011 feature investigative story, which is about 5,000 words. And that was the story that initially got the ball rolling and eventually led to the exonerations in 2014. And in 2014, I came up to Cleveland. I saw the hearing. I was there when all that happened. And then I wrote a follow-up piece, which is about 6,000 words. Again, kind of a narrative in the Cleveland scene. But still, you know, both those pieces, which are fairly long in terms of journalism, you know, that's nowhere near what a book length is. But at the same time, I remember when I filed a 6,000 word piece, I knew that I had more to say and I knew that there was more to explore. And so, you know, I had never written a book before. I didn't really understand what was involved. So what I did when I actually was like, okay, now I got to do that. Now I got to write this book. I outlined it very detailed. I outlined it in a lot of detail. And I kind of treated each chapter as like a 5,000 word cover story, which was actually really, it helped because I knew the rhythms of a 5,000 word cover story. You know, I knew, you know, the kind of tension points, the things you want to get across, the ways you could sketch characters and recall details and things like that. So that was actually a huge key, was kind of conceptualizing each chapter in a way, or at least a form of writing that I had done and was very familiar with. So that, you know, was a challenge, but that was how I kind of addressed it.
Kyle, thank you so much for reading for us. And thank you also for explaining the uphill tasks that a journalist often has in front of her or in front of him when they go about reporting a story, and for acknowledging the biases people carry with them and the power of story, like as you begin to figure things out, like how it can transform you. And, you know, while I'm on it, I was thinking about this, like how, as I was reading your book, which by the way, is I sobbed at certain parts. It's so powerful. But I couldn't get over the feeling, and I think this is on purpose, is that Cleveland is a character. Like the city is a full character. And it reminded me of like people who really love a place, they love it. They don't just love what is great about it, but they can't look away from what doesn't work. And in order to make it better, they must report what doesn't work. And I felt there was a compulsion here in your writing that you had to point to everything that wasn't working. So could you talk a bit about that compulsion and like Cleveland being a character?
Yeah, I think anybody who knows me knows that I'm a big homer. You know, I love Cleveland, although some people have said my book very clearly doesn't love it. But, you know, I do love the city that I grew up in. I feel very much a part of it. But I thought there was just such a fascinating history and such an important history that fed right directly into this book, particularly about the 1960s, particularly about, you know, the push for racial justice. You know, in 1976, just, you know, a few years before this book takes place, Carl Stokes becomes the first African-American to be elected a mayor of a major American city, and that happens in Cleveland. Similarly, about 2 years later, Cleveland was the scene of the Glenville Shootout, which was this band of black militants who opened fire on a number of Cleveland police officers. And this was before the Black Panthers. It was really the first moment of kind of armed uprising, racial racial violence in America. And so I just thought that this city had a great and very important history that had been forgotten about. But also the books that I love are often books that take an aspect of a place to explain the place and then explain, America in a larger sense. Common Ground by J. Anthony Lucas, which is about, takes place in Boston. It's about the busing crisis of the 60s and 70s. David Simon and Ed Burns' The Corner, which is about a drug corner in Baltimore. Buzz Bissinger's A Prayer for the City, which is about a mayor's first term in office. All these are stories about a certain aspect of the city, but really that become this blown out portrait of the city and also about American urban life. And that was really the ambition of this book, was to take this wrongful conviction case and use it as a way to tell a larger story about the city and about American cities.
I was going to say that, at least for me, when I was reading it, I realized that I now understand more about Cleveland from your book than I did from any of the other books. And I think it's the power of narrative, sort of like, because it's a story within a story within a story, that I can remember more and I can pull that out. But I've read other books about it, like guidebooks or history books, and some of that was just, it didn't do as much for me as your book did from the narrative point of view. And so thank you for that. Yeah.
I have another one. Describe for us your development from graduating from Kenyon College to becoming a journalist.
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey. So I went to Kenyon, was an English major at Kenyon. I think I went to Kenyon, loving books, loving writing, probably thinking I had a bit, probably thinking that I wanted to be a novelist or a short story writer or something along those lines. Went to Kenyon, realized I was terrible at being a short story writer, or at least I didn't have the imaginative faculty, I think, that was there that's required. And I also felt, everyone I think has mixed feelings about Kenyon's size. Looking back, I think it was amazing. It is a small school. It was amazing. Actually being there, I know I felt a little claustrophobic. And also this was a different, this was, the Iraq War had just started. I feel like I'm, and this is for the youngins in the room, the Iraq War had started, the 2004 presidential election, Bush v. Kerry. There was all this kind of bigger picture national stuff going on. And I really was interested and drawn to that. And I realized that being a journalist would be a way to be kind of plugged into that world while also using reading and writing. And so I had interned on in college at a business magazine in the summers in Cleveland, which was really just a fluke that I got that job. And after college, they offered me a full-time job, and I was there probably 9 months. And then I got laid off because this was 2008 when the economy exploded. So I moved to Nashville, Tennessee, because I had a great friend from college, from Kenyon, who was from Nashville, and I liked it. And, it was an affordable city to move to. And I was I worked at a coffee shop for a year, I think. And then I eventually got a job as a journalist there as a business reporter. Then I got laid off from that job. So, because of economic situations and things like that. After that, I moved to Cleveland, which is where I started working in the Cleveland scene. And that was really kind of where things really took off for me. And then I moved to Miami, where I worked at an alternative weekly there. And now I'm at the Post, the Washington Post, which I never expected that I would ever work at the Washington Post, but it's amazing. And I can't say enough good things about working at this type of institution at this time. So that's kind of, when people, it is a difficult business. Like I said, I've been laid off twice, I think, within the first 5 years. It continues to be a very difficult business, but I always tell people you just got to keep grinding if it's what you really want to do.
It's interesting what you've just said, because I feel like our stories are in inverse. I decided to get a journalism degree because I didn't have the courage to say I wanted to write fiction. And I thought, you know, I would be a journalist and it'd be fine. And then I realized I like to make shit up. And I was like, that's not going to work. Also, to be honest, you're right. It's a hard business and I couldn't cut it. Like I went off to get a graduate degree and eventually years later was like, I want to write fiction or nonfiction.
Yeah.
I do want to say this. I'm sorry, what were we saying?
Oh, nothing. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say that your prose is beautiful. So whatever else at Kenyon, your prose is just gorgeous. So,
well, I don't think nonfiction has to be flat writing.
You're right.
I definitely, I remember reading Tom Wolfe when I was in high school and having it blow my brain open and realizing that nonfiction could be as wild and the writing could be as big and, the standards could be just as demanding as fiction.
Absolutely.
And I think actually coming from the alternative weekly world, which unfortunately, they've been an endangered species for a long time. And unfortunately this Corona, pandemic right now has unfortunately killed off a lot of alternative weeklies. But what I loved about them is there was a real free flowing thing about you could write your prose could get as purple as it wanted. You could try crazy things. And it was actually a great process of getting it out of your system, I think, as a journalist and realizing what is self-indulgent and what isn't. So.
And nonfiction also has space for the imagination, like especially when you're imagining their lives in the book, like you see that. And that sort of leads me to like part 2 of the book. I remember when I got to that part and I realized that you were now going to give us Ed, the young boy who's the main witness who has lied on the stand. Mm-hmm. His point of view, I was just like, I had to put the book down because you were humanizing somebody who I was really, really angry with, and I was just ready for I was ready to hate this kid, even though I knew he was a kid, because I had so far gotten these 3 young men and I'd also gotten like what America was, what Ohio was, what Cleveland was. And like, I've lived on and off in Ohio. And so it was interesting to get to that part. And I guess I want you to talk a little bit more about that moment, like what made you choose to tell us about Ed in that way, and also like his placement in the book.
Well, I had that similar feeling, reporting it through in 2011, by that point, Ed had kind of been built up into this villain in my mind. He had lied about these 3 men and he was the one behind this. But when I knew I had to eventually get to know Ed and talk to him. And when I heard his life story, it completely took me to a different place mentally. I think you have to be empathetic, I think, to his situation and realize that he was forced to lie for a number of different circumstances, that this situation had ruined his life as much in a very serious way as it did the 3 other men. And so I often think that he's a victim as well. But I definitely wanted to kind of pull that move that I went through where you kind of, the reader hopefully will be angry with this guy and then kind of had the rug pulled out when they actually hear about his story and what he went through. So. Yeah,
that was perfect. That was just the right narrative move. Yeah.
Thank you.
Another Kenyon Review associate asks, I think a lot of people are judgmental of journalists or have misconceptions about the profession. What is one misconception that you think a lot of people have?
That's tough. I think that when people think that there's these grand kind of institutional biases that move organizations to like either make things up, just the whole fake news idea, I think is very detrimental because, there is fake news that's out there, that's put out there for nefarious reasons and for dishonest reasons. But most reporters, most people who are doing this work, they're not making things up. They don't have institutional biases. They're not bad actors. They're just doing the work. And sure, there's times when we get things wrong, or there's times when we make mistakes, but that happens, I think, in every profession. But there's not a malice behind it. There's not an institutional malice behind the mistakes that journalists do make. And I think the mark of a good journalist and a good journalist institution is when they are honest. Like, we corrected this. We need a correction for this. You have to be honest about that type of thing. But the idea that there's like grand designs about, like such and such organization is in the bag for this certain candidate and stuff like that. I don't think it's as easy as that, at least in terms of print media. Television media might be a little different, but I can't necessarily comment on that, but
You said you didn't do well as a creative writer at Kenyon. Since graduating and making a name for yourself as a journalist and with prose, have you returned to creative writing in any other genre?
No, I mean, I read fiction now. Maybe it was a little, I always have read fiction. I probably read fiction a little less now than I do nonfiction and history and things like that. And that's probably what interests me the most, the way you can present facts and present real stories. I think that that's probably, for me, where my interest lies. Although I do have a great respect for nonfiction, or for fiction writers, and do read it, and get inspired and get inspiration by, amazing prose and things like that. Still inspiring. But for me personally, I think one of the great things in life, I think, is recognizing like what you're good at and what you're not at. And I think, I know that this is kind of the track that I should be on. And so I think I'm lucky to have identified that. And I think, especially if you want to be in a somewhat creative enterprise, I think it's good having a realistic appraisal of your own skill set. I think is actually really helpful in knowing where you go from one step to the next.
Yeah. I have about 3 questions that I think I can bundle into the same question. You probably know what it is. What is it like being an investigative journalist during a COVID-19 pandemic?
That's a tough one. I think the biggest struggle that I've seen among colleagues and things like that is that this story kind of never lets up. It just is, it's constantly happening. Like every day there's new numbers, every day there's some new wrinkle, every day there's a new place that's exploding in a different way. And usually in like a major news event, a lot of the times we've heard a lot of comparisons about this to something like 9/11. Whether that's a fair comparison or not, I don't know. But for the sake of this example, 9/11 happened, and then there was like distance away from the actual event where people could take a deep breath or at least conceptualize what had happened or go back over it. There was a moment where people could exhale, and as a journalist, you could begin to examine what happened in that moment. For me now, and I think for a lot of people, it feels like this moment's just never ending. We haven't gotten to that exhalation point yet. It just, every day keeps happening, every day keeps happening. And it's incredibly difficult just to stay on top of it. It just feels like we don't have that kind of distance of perspective where we can finally put some type of rational explanation or thought or interpretation on it yet. So that's what I would say is the biggest difficulty right now.
Tied to that, how do you, and this is from another KR associate, how do you feel being a journalist in our current political climate?
Yeah, that's difficult. I think the most difficult thing is that we get kind of branded with assumptions at this point, especially the type of journalism that I like to do. And I think that where my heart is really at is kind of a more immersive journalism where you have to really get to know people. You really spend time with people. And I know a couple months ago, I was actually in Ohio, in southwestern Ohio, for a story, and I was spending a lot of time with some people. And politics never really came up, but you could tell what side of the aisle they were on, which is fine. It really wasn't a political story, but I know that this guy that I had spent a great amount of time with me, he said, my wife, she asked, because I had been over at his house a good number of times, and we were driving somewhere, and we'd gotten to know each other fairly well. And he was like, I've really enjoyed getting to know you. And I was like, exactly, same, thank you for inviting me your life and letting me, you know, see how you live. And he said, yeah, when you first turned up, my wife was worried. She was like, are you actually going to let him into the house? A Washington Post reporter. I thought, like, you know, that it was funny, but also like terrible that we kind of have that stigma on us now. So that's difficult, but that's also, I think, if you do this work well and if you do it honestly, I think you can overcome that. So it's just more, there's more difficulty in getting that trust with people, I think. But I think if you do this work well and if you do it, like I said, honestly, you should be able to overcome that kind of barrier. You know?
I think it's interesting that you talk about stigma, because so much of the book with these three men is them getting over the stigma of who they are, of them trying to figure out how to live a life outside of their, you know, outside of what has happened to them and what they have been told that they've done. Like there's that great moment of Kwame, like when he meets his wife, and every single time he tries to talk to a woman, she gets this hard look because he's still in a way, he's still that young boy who went in, who has that easy style, who loves to talk a great deal. And he's like, he talks to her and he knows also that he has to tell her the truth about her life. Yeah. So it is an interesting moment in the book. And also what you're talking about is that you have to be about as truthful to yourself as you can be when you're telling the story. And so it brings me back to the beginning, actually, because there's this great moment in the beginning of your book where you are talking about how you've got a stack of letters from people who are writing to you all the time, telling you that they've been wrongfully convicted. And so what out of that stack of letters, if that was the case, made you pick this story, these people? What about their truthfulness spoke to you?
Well, this one didn't come from a letter. It came directly from a lawyer who I knew, who had talked with Kwame and who recommended me. But, you know, that stack of letters that I mentioned, you know, I say that like every journalist gets a lot of letters from jail, from people, you know, saying that they were wrongfully convicted. And many of us have the experience where you begin investigating those stories and realize it's not true, or it's more complicated, or the person's more complicit than they're making it out to be. And it becomes very difficult. I think some of it was luck that I met Kwame, but I also think I was willing to listen. You know, I picked up the phone and said I would meet with him, and I went in kind of with you know, I went in willing to listen and hear what he had to say, and I think that was pretty key to how this all started.
Yeah.
This one's kind of long, from Elena. It must have been transformative to learn all the harsh realities that you did with taking on this story, particularly in regards to the way the criminal justice system operates in America. And perhaps this is hard to say, for this story came to you relatively early on in your career, but all the same, how did reporting this story shape or change the way you viewed your role as a reporter? And what impact does this story continue to have on you and your reporting today?
No, that's a great question. I mean, I would say that it's true that I did have to like confront a lot of like really ugly things about not only our prison system, but how our criminal justice system works, and the pervasive racism and unfairness of that system. But I think that this whole process and seeing these men exonerated, you know, it did make me a very true believer in the work and how important journalism is, and how it's just so much worthwhile to do the work and to keep grinding and to keep going, even, you know, in a bad business climate, even when people are afraid to invite you into their home, you know, because of some bull crap, you know, the work is really important, you know, and I think across the board, it's important, not just the stuff I do, but everyone everywhere, I think that takes up this work, it's really important. And it's really made me a true believer and a big advocate for journalism.
How do you know if there is enough of a story to warrant a book?
That's a great question, because I think you see it a lot with journalism projects that were either like great magazine stories or great, you know, newspaper features. And then when you try to blow that out into a book, it really kind of, it doesn't have the legs to kind of support such a longer structure. I think what's really important is, I like to think of stories in dimension, in terms of dimensions, so like this first dimension of this story is obviously what actually happened to these guys. These three men, they're the road of them, going to jail and eventually being exonerated. I thought like a third dimension to that was the history of Cleveland and the racism involved. And maybe the fourth dimension was nationally how the criminal justice system has changed due to political pressure over the last 60 and 70 years. And so when I think when you start seeing these different dimensions kind of develop, or these different sides, then you really can tell that it's going to be a book. For example, a good example of this is, there's a chapter where they talk about, I think it's like the fourth or fifth chapter. It's about when they're on death row. And I realized that during this period of time, they're on death row and eventually they're released because of a Supreme Court decision. What was really fascinating was writing about that kind of battle that was happening in the Supreme Court. I mean, we just take it for granted now that we're in a country that has capital punishment. But in the late 70s, it was an actual fairly robust movement to defeat the death penalty. And there was a number of Supreme Court cases and court battles that were going to try to get rid of, across the country. And it was a really interesting kind of moment to highlight that I could easily, and not in a hackneyed ways, fit into that chapter and talk about. So I guess that's kind of like it. If you can, the Ed Vernon chapters, this isn't a spoiler, but Ed is homeless and becomes a drug addict, a crack addict for many years. And his experience with crack cocaine dovetailed incredibly, ran right parallel to crack hitting American streets and really disfiguring American cities. And so it was a really interesting way to explore that kind of universe. And so I felt that every chapter there was a second element besides the main narrative line that I could go through and talk about. That really made me feel like, this is a book length project.
We got one on Twitter.
Okay.
How does the narrative of your writing change based on the truth you want to deliver? Do you try to sway people's opinions, or do you let them flesh out their own thoughts from what you present in your writing?
For me personally, I'm not a great polemicist. I don't think I would be a great opinion writer. I think that I work best in just telling a story and telling a narrative. And so in this book in particular, although there might be some veers into a more like an argument, I think mainly I'm just trying to tell a story and lay out the facts. And I actually think that that's more, in my opinion, I think a story is much more of a story is a better argument than an argument necessarily, if that makes sense. You can really sway people with empathy, with facts by doing the work of storytelling better than kind of hitting them over the head with logic or examples or things like that. But then again, I'm not great at arguing on paper. So, that's just my, I think my preference.
I think we have time for one more. I'll add, there are clap, 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 and thank yous coming in. But we'll end with this one. I've noticed that more and more, a lot of journalism is online rather than in print. And the velocity at which articles are being published seems to be constantly increasing. Do you think this is a good thing or a bad thing, and why?
Well, I think it depends. Like breaking news, you do have to get that out there now, especially in something like a crisis that we're in. You do need to break news and alert people. One thing about this pandemic is I think it's kind of, I hope it's made people realize the benefit of news and accurate news, and because it does mean a lot for people's lives if their neighborhood is blowing up with COVID-19 and they don't know about it. But I also but good journalism, and I'm very, very lucky to work at the Post, a place that values taking time to work on things and taking a step back and taking the time that's needed. I couldn't be more lucky to work in a place that still values that, because a lot of this work does take time, especially like the immersive narrative stuff. you know, is a lot of just like a person like me showing up and hanging out and getting to know people and just being there. You know, really you want to get to a point where you're just absorbing somebody's life and writing about it honestly. And you can only do that really when you get to the level where you're just kind of forget about you and you're just there and trying to reflect their life honestly. And that takes time. It 100% takes a lot of time.
Well, Kyle, thank you so much. This has been extremely informative.
Thank you.
It's going to change the way that I read my news tonight and watch. But yeah, thank you so much for being a part of this experiment called the Virtual Reading Series. And I will point our audience back to the bookshop, which is available at kenyonreview.org, where you can get Kyle's book.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Take care.
See ya.